It is with great pleasure that we welcome all of you as participants to our event. Today, Professor Peter Wagner is joining us with an opening speech entitled Modernity, Between Philosophy, History, and Sociology. With modernity, the theme of our symposium this year again, Professor Wagner was literally the first name that came to mind with regards to this subject. So I really want to extend our sincere gratitude to him for having accepted our invitation and also for accommodating us after having twice postponed due to the uncertainties of the pandemic. Professor Wagner is a renowned social and political theorist who has been at the Catalan Institution for Research and Advanced Studies at the University of Barcelona since 2010. The professor holds degrees in economics, political science, and also in sociology from the universities of Hamburg, London, and Berlin. He has worked as a professor of sociology and also social and political theory at the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom, the University of Trento in Italy, and the European University of Institute located in beautiful Florence, also of course in Italy. Professor Wagner has also been a research fellow at the Berlin Social Science Center, a projector director at Ural Federal University in Russia, as well as having amassed a commanding list of visiting professorships at the University of Hamburg, the University of Paris 8, Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium, the University of Cape Town in South Africa, the School of Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in France, the University of California at Berkeley, the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study, the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and many more besides. He is also a member of the Academy of Europe, and he currently chairs the Social Change and Social Thought section at the Academy. Professor Wagner's research has a base that is centered upon comparative historical and political sociology, social and political theory, and also sociology of the social sciences. His focus is predominantly on the identification and comparative analysis of different forms of social and political modernity, and also of the historical trajectories of modern societies. In recent years, Professor Wagner has focused his work on world sociology, focusing on the tensions that can exist between the struggle for autonomy and persisting forms of domination, and in exploring the current possibilities of progression in the light of historical experiences in different world regions. For a moment, I wondered about listing even half of the professor's publications, but then realized there will be little or no time left for us to listen to what he has to say. If you have questions, by the way, please write them down in the Q&A section during his speech. I know that you're all eager to hear from the professor rather than me. So now, without further ado, I hand you over the eminent Professor Wagner.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the for the invitation, first of all, and for the very kind presentation. It's a great pleasure and a great honor for me to speak to you. Of course, I would have preferred to meet you all in person, but maybe that can be done at another occasion. Now we first have to get through this pandemic and see how we make best sense of it in terms of what it means for our social and political lives and organization. Let me start my presentation by going back to a debate which most of you will know and which is now almost 40 years old. It is the debate, I go back to it because it is the one in which the term modernity first came into use in philosophy and the social sciences. Modernity as a noun of this kind. Obviously the term modern has been used much before, and the term modernization as well after the Second World War. But the term modernity as a noun of that kind dates back to the 1970s. And it is probably not exaggerated to say that the debate around this term was triggered by a rather small publication by a French philosopher, Jean-François Lyotard, which actually was a report for the government of Quebec in Canada. So it was not really meant to be a major publication, but it turned out to be one, not least because Lyotard used the term postmodern in the title, the Postmodern Condition. You all know this report on knowledge as it was subtitled. Now, what Lyotard was doing, well, one could say it has remained a bit unclear throughout in a long discussion, but clearly he was doing two things at the same time. He identified what he saw as a major social transformation, namely some step out of modernity into a new situation, a postmodern condition. And he combined this and to some extent based it on a critique of social theory and social philosophy, namely claiming that social life consists of coexisting language games, a plurality of language games, and thus arguing that the most prominent social philosophical attempts at making the social world intelligible had ultimately failed because they couldn't really grasp this plurality of language games. So there were two diagnoses at the same time, one more in the realm of social philosophy or social theory, and the other one in terms of an empirical sociology of social transformations. And for this reason, this I think is the one of the main reasons why this contribution remains interesting, because it combined philosophical reflection and empirical sociological analysis, and this under the heading of modernity. Now, what was striking about the rather large and wide debate that ensued after this was that these two elements were largely taken apart again. Let me give you just two examples, which again, most of you will know. Jürgen Habermas published his lectures on which he called the Philosophical Discourse of Modernity a few years after Lyotard. And he was trying to show that we don't need to postulate the individual knowing subject as a basis of modernity, but can talk about intersubjective communication as such a basis. So he took a critical stand against much of the earlier debate in philosophy, the philosophy of the subject, and at the same time was trying to minimize the impact of the argument about postmodernity. What is interesting about this Habermas's contribution is that it is well compatible with his earlier, more sociological work, as in the theory of communicative action, but not very well linked to it at all. So that's more a philosophical contribution that goes away from the sociological analysis. In turn, at about the same time, the late Ulrich Beck published Risk Society with the subtitle Towards Another Modernity. And he, in a sense, was taking the opposite step. He had worked in the philosophy of social science before, but this book was really an analysis of a social transformation based on lots of somewhat eclectically assembled empirical observations. So there we have a sociological argument about a social transformation, the transformation of modernity, but very little of the philosophical background. So this, I think, therefore, remains an open question about how we deal with the two different discourses of modernity in philosophy and sociology. So this is one of the tasks I set myself for the presentation today. And I go back to this debate also for a number of other reasons. Even though it is superseded to some extent, it is still telling us something about the time in which it took place. And I will come back to that at the end. The time at which it took place is probably the beginning of a social transformation in which we still live. Secondly, as already said, it allows us to recombine or to reflect at least about the relation between sociology and philosophy with regard to modernity. And thirdly, clearly all the authors I mentioned and many others that contributed in that debate, they were thinking about modernity in the original meaning of the term modern, namely about the specificity of the present, the time we are living in. And that means also that they necessarily make a comparative argument about the present in relation to the past. So they take a historical perspective, even without being historians, And that is the third component, which we have to add to the discussion to see how we situate modernity, our current modernity, in historical time. So this then sets the stage of my presentation. And now I would like to share a screen with you, if that could please be put up for a moment. I will tell you, this is something I learned from my children. This is called a spoiler. So if you don't like spoilers, don't read this and don't listen to me for 2 minutes. You may know that spoilers tell you the whole plot of a story, of a novel and a movie, so that you will not be surprised and there will be no suspense. Well, what I'm presenting is not a detective novel, so I thought it might be useful to give you a short outline of what I will be saying, to make it easier to follow me, because I will construct what I think is a quite complex argument, which may be, it may be easier to listen to when one has the structure in mind before. So what I will be trying to do is, in a first step, look at 3 standard accounts of modernity, mostly disciplinary accounts in philosophy, in sociology, and in history. And I will, this will be rather short, but we will see that all of these 3 accounts are rather linear progressive, and they all tend to focus on Europe. But when one places them next to each other, it becomes visible that they overlap, but also that they are not quite compatible with each other. So then, with this opening statement, I will try to bring them together. And I do that by first enriching the historical account, make it more complex. And then, with the help of this enrichment, we'll historically contextualize the philosophical and the sociological account, place them in their own time of elaboration. By doing that, it should become visible that both of these, the philosophical and the sociological account, have rather profound flaws. So modernity is neither based on a superior insight into the human condition, as the philosophical account tended to claim, nor on a more functional institutional arrangement of social life, as the sociological account tended to assume. So from this second step, I will conclude that it is more appropriate to see modernity as a societal self-understanding based on the interpretation of the human condition in the light of specific experiences. Such self-understanding can find a somewhat consolidated expression in institutions. This is what sociologists tended to argue, or also political philosophers. But we will not arrive at a clearly superior or the best kind of such institutions, because the modern commitment is open to interpretation, such there is also always the possibility for a variety of interpretations, and any such institutionalization can be subject to critique in the light of new experiences in particular. So these are the steps of my argument, and in the light of these insights, I will conclude with some observations on what the analysis of modernity today has to focus on, namely on aspects that tended to be neglected for a long time. And I will focus on 3. First of all, on ways in which modernity transforms in the light of new experiences, and will in particular look at this most recent transformation of modernity in which we live. Secondly, the global connectedness of modernity rather than an idea of a diffusion of a single model. And thirdly, I will make some observations on the need to bring the use of biophysical resources into the historical analysis of modernity, rather than assuming, which both philosophy and sociology have tended to do, that modernity is a social political phenomenon without any material base. So this is the overview. And now I think we can dispense with this text again. And I will start my presentation with the first step, the separate accounts of modernity. The screen can be taken away again. Thank you. So let me start with the standard philosophical account of modernity. In philosophy, the standard theoretical understanding of modernity is based on the 2 key concepts of individual freedom and instrumental mastery. It is most clearly visible in Enlightenment, which is often taken to be the basis of the philosophy of modernity under the title Freedom and Reason. So the combination of these two principles is often seen to define what it means to be modern. Now, in this philosophical reasoning, this is not seen to be an arbitrary choice, but this double commitment results from the radical search for the foundations on which to base human social life. There are two main authors and events that stand at the origins of philosophical modernity. Again, many of you will know this. It is the standard account after all. What I'm telling you in the opening here is not very new. On the one side, this is René Descartes and his Discourse on Method of 1637, which grounds the certainty of knowledge in the thinking subject alone. So the knowing subject as the core of modernity. And on the other side, Thomas Hobbes and his Leviathan of just a few years later, 1651, which grounds political order in individual human beings' interest in self-preservation. So we have here with these two authors an epistemological and a political philosophical basis of modernity. In both cases, the main move was to go away from earlier ways of reaching certainty and political stability, which was seen as speculative or unviable, and to place the individual human being in the center as the only possible source for such achievements. Free from illegitimate constraints, this human being will make use of their capacity for reason to place knowledge and politics on firm grounds. Now we can go on from there quickly, then we can see how the revolutions of the late 18th century, like the American Declaration of Independence and the French Revolution, were seen as indeed an exemplification of the political commitment to modernity as a social contract between reasonable individuals, that the Industrial Revolution was an expression of instrumental reason, of mastery over nature, that the commercial revolution, the market revolution, places interests over passions, in the formulation used by Albert Hirschman in the 1970s, that a commercial society is a more rational and less passionate and violent prone social order. Now, of course, we all know that in the 19th century and the 20th century, this became more ambivalent, the whole view, the philosophical view of modernity. But even the critical social philosophy that emerges, starting with Marx, going through Max Weber, through Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, even though they concluded skeptically or negatively on the fate of modernity, they also argued on the basis of the original promise of freedom and mastery. So the assumption that modernity is grounded on individual freedom and instrumental mastery was also taken as the basis for critical reasoning. And then we also have versions of philosophy, we could call it economic philosophy and political philosophy, more strictly speaking, from the late 19th century onwards until the late 20th century, where in neoclassical economics, you have theories of rational expectations, starting also out from the individual economic subject, or social contract theory has been revived by John Rawls with his theory of justice of 1971. So if we take these elements together, we have here overall the idea, sometimes implicitly, sometimes more explicitly, that there is, that one can arrive at a superior knowledge, superior insight into the human condition based on the individual human being and their rationality. Then one can reason about the appropriate kinds of social institutions to be derived from this assumption. So if human beings do that, then we have what we can call a triumphant interpretation of modernity as the increasing commitment to individual freedom and instrumental mastery. Let me just add one more remark to this, to more recent critical social philosophy, more recent in the sense of not standing in the tradition of critical theory from Marx to the Frankfurt School, but going beyond it, namely in late 20th century feminism and post-colonial thinking. We have there the same assumption that the European philosophy of modernity is based straightforwardly on the commitments to individual autonomy and mastery. But there the emphasis is that these commitments have been turned into tools of domination by reserving autonomy to male Europeans and by employing an instrumental attitude to nature, but also to other human beings, in particular subjects of colonial domination. These are important, more recent developments, but for my purposes here, I also want to underline that they accept the main the view of the European philosophy of modernity as based on individual freedom and instrumental mastery. And they are at the risk, I will say that in more detail later, of providing something like a caricature of the philosophy of modernity. That far the standard philosophical account. Let me come to the sociological account. This account, first of all, we need to note, only emerges in the 19th century, so later than the philosophical account, partly because sociology only emerges in the 19th century in the form in which we know it today. Sociology indeed has been a knowledge form to understand modernity, which also means then that what the sociological analysis was about was understanding social developments of their own time. And they did that in what we today recognize as an analysis of modernity, even though the key authors didn't use those terms. Now, let me briefly just highlight some of these elements. We look here really at what is the long European 19th century, lasting from the French Revolution in 1789 to the beginning of the First World War in 1914. So at a range of scholars reaching from, in the early period, Henri de Saint-Simon and Hegel, to Alexis de Tocqueville and Karl Marx in the middle of the 19th century, to Emil Durkheim, Max Weber, and Georg Simmel at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. These are the sociological theorists of modernity. They are treated like that in a canonized way. Now, what were they really arguing? They argued that with all differences between them, we know I touched on many schools of sociological thinking, they all assumed that a profound rupture in social life had taken place and that it had brought about, or was to bring about, a radically new form of social relations and social structure. And they made the analysis of this new form their key concern. Very briefly, to start with, they saw that modernity brought with itself novel attitudes to the world, as well as to other human beings, which were captured by terms such as abstract freedom, individual instrumental rationality, egotistical calculation, as Marx and Engels called it, individualism and Occidental rationalism. These are attitudes. And these attitudes bring about in new social constellations in which human beings find themselves, which were captured by terms such as industry, division of labor, democracy, bourgeois society, class struggle, and capitalism. So depending on the authors and the time of writing, they all claim that these attitudes and constellations emerged or arose to dominance in Europe and then in North America from the late 18th and early 19th century onwards. So again, comparing this briefly to the standard philosophical account, we see here similarities. There is certainly a common focus on individuals and their rationality. But here we have this less as an argument about knowledge, as philosophy approaches is, but rather as attitudes of human beings and changing, newly emerging attitudes. Secondly, as I already said, this understanding emerges later than the philosophical discourse of modernity, and that also means it addresses a different epoch. We will come back to that in the next step. And thirdly, what is rather new here is that with this focus on individuals and rationality, sociology then emphasizes the emerging structures or constellations that becomes what is typical of sociology beyond the conceptual foundations of the understanding of modernity as we find them in philosophy. So my third step in this first section is then to relate this, these observations from philosophy and sociology to a standard historical account. And there we know that the standard view, the European view of European history, indeed makes a distinction between early modern times, which lasts from roughly 1500 to 1800, and modernity itself, from 1800 to the present or to the very recent past. What the emphasis in the study of early modern times is really, or has been, an emphasis on understanding the conditions for modernity to arise. With this term early modernity, historians try to say two things at the same time, that modernity is not quite there, but it is preparing itself. It is about to come about. And then there are many elements which look at European history to try to understand how modernity could arise in this context. I just give a few examples, key examples. The plurality of sites of power between the Pope and the Emperor, but also between several political coexisting orders, or between cities and territorial states. The rationalization of political power through centralization. The emergence of autonomous knowledge-producing institutions with universities and academies, or the emergence of what later came to be called civil society, namely the strengthening and diversification of social relations, again, often starting within the cities or with new forms of communication. These are all observations that are historically more or less accurate, but they are all used, and that is of interest for me here, to try to see how modernity, the emergence of modernity prepared itself in European history in early modern times. In modernity itself, from 1800 onwards, the key element is indeed the one of a rupture, the triple revolution of first the Enlightenment preceded by the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, and what some scholars call the democratic revolution, with the political changes starting in the US and France. And from there onwards, the view is indeed of a new society, new social form coming about, but which unfolds as a kind of dynamic from the starting point. Now, you may already think, some of you may think that this is a bit of a caricature of these three accounts. And to some extent it is, or let's say it's a stylized presentation. But now I want to make the argument more complex, starting by enriching the historical account. Let me mention first an anecdotal element. When I came to Spain, and not least when our children started to learn history in school, I came to learn that in Spanish and in Spain, the modern era indeed lasts from 1500 to 1800, or rather 1492 to 1800, from the so-called discovery of America to the Napoleonic Wars in the Spanish context. Whereas the period afterwards is called the contemporary age. So Spanish terminology predates modernity, so to say. It puts it into the period where other European historians only see early modernity. Now, this may well be related to the fact that especially the 16th century is often seen as the golden age in Spanish history. It is underlined that this is a period of modernity, the highest power that the Spanish state reached in history. But it is indicative of different ways of interpreting and also of evaluating historical changes depending on where one is. And this is within European history, where the history writing has largely marginalized the Iberian experiences of Spain and Portugal, with placing an emphasis on later periods. And that maybe we can discuss that later, how that then also relates. I will come to some elements of world history, world regional history, but how that relates also to the Ottoman and Turkish experiences across this half millennium. Let me say that now, for the purpose of the presentation, I think one can say, even globally, even in a world historical perspective, that the two main periods of transformation around 1500 and around 1800 remain significant, even with an enriched historical account. But they are threshold periods, but different emphases emerge with a wider view. Let me give you just three dates, which you all know as well. 1543, which can be called the Fall of Constantinople or the conquest of Istanbul, but it also relates to the period of what in Spain is called the reconquering of Islamic territories in the south of the Iberian Peninsula. So a shift in power balances in Europe and Eurasia with the rise of the Ottoman Empire. Secondly, 1492, obviously, the beginning of what some materially oriented historians call the Colombian Exchange, namely the globalization in the sense that material products, especially agricultural products, foodstuffs, are become globalized, that they are transported from regions where they did not exist and exchanged. Incidentally, when preparing this presentation, I went back to an old analysis from the early 1970s about the foundations of the modern world, which also points out that through the Colombian Exchange, what the authors, Italian authors, Romano and Tenienti, called Turkish beverages become more widely diffused in Europe. So there is this exchange, material exchange, which is a form of globalization, and at the same time, what has been called the Trilateral Atlantic trade, trilateral in the sense that increasingly, slowly but increasingly, African labor is employed on American soil to provide the material basis for European industrializations, to set Europeans free for industrial labor through using the agricultural labor of Africans on American soil. And the third date, 1517, in Europe known as the Reformation, the Lutheran aspect of the Reformation, which another aspect I will come back to, is a loss of cosmological unity within Christianity and the background to the religious wars. This is part of the standard account as well, but in the standard account, it is often seen as a step towards greater rationality by making within Christianity, religion, something more individual and not collective, communal. But in a broader perspective, it is more significant to see this as the background to the religious wars, the intra-Christian religious wars in Europe. That much about the first threshold. The second threshold around 1800 has been refocused upon, and I only give you three indications in recent scholarly work. The first is the argument about the Great Divergence by economic historians, pointing out that what has been called the European takeoff or the rise of Europe, and set into the context of preparatory developments inside Europe before, is really, in a comparative perspective, a different light is thrown on it, namely by seeing that in areas of China and some areas of South Asia, one sees rather similar conditions to those in Western Europe in terms of many of these aspects that normally are underlined for the European takeoff. So that the fact that production in Europe increases very rapidly from 1800 onwards needs to be explained much more contingently, much more related to particular factors in Europe than the long-term European history. Secondly, rather than emphasizing revolutionary ruptures, historians have pointed out that in Europe we actually have for a long time, as Arno Meyer has labeled it, a persistence of the old regime, that even though the economy and industry are radically altered from the early 19th century onwards, this is much less true for social and political organization. And thirdly, another aspect I will come back to, is what environmental historians call the vertical frontiers, that uniquely in world history, the control of resources is not achieved through territorial expansion as earlier empires have done so across the world, in Europe, in Minor Asia, in East Asia, but through vertical frontiers, through digging in the ground to have access to little used biophysical resources, in particular coal in the first period of the Industrial Revolution. These are aspects I will be coming back to. So this enriched historical account with these few examples I've given should show that in contrast to the standard account, one needs from the beginning have a more global dimension, a world historical dimension on transformations, so that things that look internally European actually become a larger spatial dimension. And secondly, that even though both of these periods are periods of transformation and of rupture, there is a less radical rupture, especially in social political terms. These periods were less revolutionary than they have often been seen. These observations, these historical observations then form the basis for me in the next step to reread the philosophical and the sociological account of modernity with this wider lens, with a lens that takes into account global connectedness on the one hand, and more smooth, more open developments in contrast to the emphasis of very strong ruptures. So let me come back to philosophy. I said that Descartes and Hobbes, they were searching for certainty, epistemic certainty and political certainty respectively. That is certainly true and also widely accepted. But it is much less widely understood that their search was not at all triumphant, but rather it was motivated by the concern about prevailing uncertainty, about loss of certainty. And this is where the religious wars in Europe come in, the period in the context of which both of them were writing, so that in epistemic terms, it was exactly the success of the Reformation in parts of Europe that had destroyed the common cosmology on which knowledge had been based. In turn, in political terms, this means that one could no longer rely on shared values and principles. It was those profound doubts about having anything in common with other human beings which led Descartes and Hobbes to resort to the individual as the only source of certainty in epistemic terms, and as the only immediate holder of rights in political terms. So taking this step, they had created a problem of which they were well aware. If we are all individuals, and if our actions are only grounded in ourselves as individuals, how is understanding others and acting in concert with others possible? And their answer was reason. But also, again, not because of a great faith in reason, but because no other source was available to answer this question. So the combination of individuality and rationality was established as a new ground for epistemology and political philosophy, triggered by the profound crisis of the destruction of the earlier common ground. Having said this, let me take one historical step backwards and say that while this in more recent work in the history of ideas has become more widely accepted, there is still, for Descartes and Hobbes, there is still less focus on debates a century earlier. And there we see the significance of the Atlantic crossings. Namely, what happened with the Atlantic crossings was that the Spanish seafarers, they landed into territory where they found people, they encountered people whom they had not expected and who were completely unknown to Europeans. Some of you may be aware of the work by Edward Said about Orientalism and other works in Eurasian history, where one can say many things about the views of others within Eurasia. But the important, the basis there is that the others were always already known. In Europe, one knew about people living further east. In China, one knew about people living further west. Maybe one didn't know much about them. The connections were very thin and not stable, not continuous, but one knew there were other human beings whom one tried to understand as others. The situation was radically different with the arrival in what came to be called America, because these others, they were not expected and one didn't know anything about them. This has led within Spain to what has been called the Valladolid-Salamanca debates of 1550 and 1551, where indeed the Spanish king asked philosophers and legal scholars to give advice about how to deal with Native Americans, as we call them now. And this debate by now has been well analyzed with Bartolomé de las Casas on the one side and Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda on the other. Arguably, this has given rise to the first abstract formulation of human rights, namely saying that with regard to these unknown others, one first has to determine whether they are human beings. And secondly, once one does that, one has to think about what the minimum requirements are for dealing with other human beings about one knows nothing else. In that sense, an abstract conception of the rights of others. Now we know that these rights, even though Las Casas' formulation was accepted by the Spanish king at that moment, it didn't have much impact on colonial practices in the Americas. But we see there the importance of this moment, the context of the philosophical transformation. So there we can also understand better why John Locke suggested somewhat later in the second treatise on government that in the beginning all the world was America. He could assume that from the little he knew about, but he tried to get knowledge as much as possible about Native Americans, that the hypothesis of a social contract had a basis in the social organization of Native Americans. What do we take from this? We can understand from this contextualization that this supposed breakthrough in the philosophy of modernity should not be seen as unequivocal in solving fundamental problems of humanity, springing from great European minds. Rather, it was a response to novel and highly critical experiences that demanded explicit answers to questions that had never before been posed in fundamental terms. Let me add here another observation. As you may be aware, there is by now a quite intense debate about East Asian concepts of rights and democracy related back to Confucianism. I'm not at all an expert in these debates, but one can see one main difference, namely that in Chinese intellectual traditions, such ruptures had not taken place. The ruptures of the split in cosmology and the encounter of completely unknown and unexpected others. So the ruptures that are characteristic of these forms of European philosophical thought did not occur in Chinese intellectual history. But that is not an advantage of superiority. It's a different kind of context for epistemic and political philosophical reasoning. Secondly, I see that I probably am going into too much detail, so we'll try to speed up a bit. Where a more contextual view should allow us also to think about what the understanding of freedom is that goes with the emphasis on the individual and the rationality. First of all, and this is related to the argument about the persistence of the old regime, we can clearly see that this principle was not implemented in European history after 1800, even though it was very strongly visible as a principle. And one can also not say that modernity just remains incomplete, as Jürgen Habermas tended to say, and that it needed to be completed over time. Rather, one sees in European history that justifications were given, certainly until the middle of the 20th century, for why women cannot have equal rights to men, why colonial subjects cannot have equal rights to the citizens of European societies, why propertyless laborers cannot have the same sense of responsibility as property owners. These are explicit justifications for political forms that do not adhere to the principle of equal rights of freedom to everyone. And they are not just remainders of the past, they are explicitly argued and justified by both political philosophers and by practitioners of politics. This is the second aspect of the contextualizing of the socio-philosophical account. And thirdly, we need to reflect upon the fact that modern society, as it was to be called, in that sense, was supposed to emerge only in one world region to start with. Now, of course, we can see that roughly from the middle of the 20th century onwards, some commitment to formal equal freedom was achieved in West European societies and in North America. So the societies, as some observers had it, started to resemble to the philosophical account of modernity. But what does it mean that this happens in only one region? We need to think here in analogy to the argument about socialism in one country, which the Soviet Union faced in the 20th century. We need to construct an argument about the possibility of modernity in one world region. And the key observation here is that this cannot just be seen in terms of the diffusion of modernity, that modernity arrives in one world region earlier than in others, but will arrive in others as well. Rather, if one looks more closely at the political history of those supposedly modern societies, one can see that by adopting the principle of equal freedom, they indeed displace problems to other societies in the world. Well, they displace problems in two ways, to which I will come back at the end. They displace them to other regions of the world. They displace them in space through colonial domination. But they also displace them in time through, not least, resource exploitation, the limits of which we have come to see in more recent history with the ecological debate and the debate about climate change. So my conclusion of this review of the philosophical account of modernity is that there certainly is, from the Enlightenment period onwards, the emergence of an imaginary of individual freedom and rational mastery, which is very strong. But the ensuing history cannot be read as a progress towards realizing these principles, but rather as struggles over the interpretation of these principles and over and of the displacements of the problems that come with the adoption of these principles. So, having said that, let me move to a more contextual view of the sociological account. For that, let me remind you briefly of what I said about the sociology of modernity in the 19th century without using that name. And since you know these authors, just keep them in mind. What was it, what they were doing from Hegel to Marx to Weber and Durkheim? We see them as theorists of modernity, but they saw themselves, first of all, as analysts of their own time, providing a diagnosis of the present. And doing so, and due to the fact that they were situated in the European 19th century, their perspective was much shaped by the European experiences of that time. Having said that, and in the light of what I said before about the Great Divergence, about the trilateral Atlantic relations, about the use of resources, then we can see that the main feature of the European 19th century was not the growth of modern institutions and a modern self-understanding as such, but rather the rise of Europe to world domination for a number of reasons, many of which have nothing to do with the conception of modernity, but rather with the rise of industry, with it of wealth and power, highly asymmetrically distributed. The social political transformation that has often been seen to accompany the techno-economic transformation remained very limited. Now this, just to add to that, this is broadly being recognized at various points. So Marx and Engels write in the Communist Manifesto that the discovery of America and the rounding of the Cape gave an impulse never before known to the revolutionary bourgeoisie. But if you remember that text, which many of you will have read, this is a remark they make at the beginning to talk about the revolutionary bourgeoisie, which is then not at all followed up upon when the account becomes a much more inter-European account. So the 19th century social theorists rather misconceived the causes of the European social transformations of the same period. Having seen this, we can take a closer look at these analyses. And there we see, I've touched upon that before, that this early sociology of modernity made really two fundamental assumptions. First, that there was a major rupture in history, exemplified by the Industrial Revolution mostly, and to some extent the French Revolution, which actually was not very much theorized, with the exception of Tocqueville. And secondly, that as a consequence of this rupture, there was a dynamics of history which did not exist before, a push towards a further change of the fabric of social relations. Now, having said that, we see indeed that most of these theorists, they didn't really theorize modernity in the sense of creating a conceptual portrait, an image of modernity that is stable. The one exception may be Durkheim, who came close to this. But our later sociological image of modernity, very much influenced by Tarkot Parsons, developed such an imagery, which, to stay with these two examples, neither Marx or Weber ever had. Marx analyzed capitalism, but not at all as a stable social formation, but insisting on the antagonism in the underlying social relations that would prevent any market from stabilizing into an economic system, as Parsons called it. And Weber's, well, Iron Cage is the official translation. Literally, it's rather the dwelling place of steel. Looks like a portrait, but it is a visual metaphor to illustrate the outcome of rationalization. But at the same time, Weber was very skeptical about the stability of this construction, expected it to be challenged and possibly dismantled because of its rise of, because of its lack of desirability. So, to remind you of, again, very well-known phrases, Marx and Engels talk about the progressive march of history with the bourgeoisie and the rising proletariat in the Communist Manifesto, but they also raise the concern about the possible common ruin of the contending classes as an outcome of history. Or Weber, who is read as talking about ongoing rationalization processes, also conjectured about the return of old values and the rise of new profits. So by the end of the 19th century, the early 20th century, we have this analysis of the dynamics of modernity, but we don't have a theory of a stable modernity. And we can see in Weber very clearly, but also in other classical sociologists of that period, Weber, Durkheim, Simmel, Wilfredo Pareto, that they were no longer writing at the dawn of a new era, as Hegel and maybe to some extent Marx did. They were taking account of a historical transformation, which indeed led in their period to something like a first crisis of modernity that had emerged from 19th century events, a crisis due to the developments of economic and political institutions across the 19th century. And for that reason, we read these authors also for their often very sophisticated methodological and observations and philosophies of social science, but they were driven to these methodological and philosophical considerations, not least because they did not have a firm grip on understanding the present and what it would lead to. All these theorists whom I mentioned, Weber, Durkheim, Simmel, and Pareto, they died shortly after the end of the First World War. So we don't know, the period of classical sociology ends at that moment. We don't know what they would have said afterwards, how they would have diagnosed modernity as it evolved further. So we have to go to other authors, and there we indeed see, who are much less canonized, a change in the interpretation of modernity. Let me give you briefly 3 examples. In 1935, Karl Mannheim published Man and Society in an Age of Reconstruction with a focus on fundamental democratization. And he did this at the moment where German democracy, where he, of Hungarian origin, was living then, had already broken down. In 1944, Karl Polanyi published The Great Transformation, and he has often been misread as looking at the rise of market society, but he was looking at the rise and fall of market society in the aftermath of the Great Depression, and indeed, for him too, in the rise of totalitarian regimes. And thirdly, after the Second World War and after the defeat of Nazism, Hannah Arendt writes The Origins of Totalitarianism, where again she shows an incompatibility between imperialist capitalism on the one hand and nation-state-based democracy on the other. So again, looking at the lack of coherence and lack of compatibility of these modern forms of social organization. So we see there that by the middle of the 20th century, any view of modernity as stabilizing itself had disappeared. There was no sense of smooth evolution any longer, no regularity and predictability, rather interrogations and questions, and a look at the contingency of historical outcomes, namely the possibility that things could have turned out otherwise had human beings acted differently at key moments in history. So that is where we are in the middle of the 20th century. Now, then things change in the theorizing of modernity. And we indeed, by 1970, arrive at a different picture by which we are still shaped and which we relate to. This has mostly to do with what French observer Jean Fourastier has called the 30 glorious years with regard to the West, or in particular Western Europe, namely the period between the end of the Second World War and the early 1970s. This was the period of rapid economic growth, the stabilization of Western liberal democracy, the emergence of welfare states and consumer society in this region of the world. So this led to a stabilization of the image of modernity. And then we have a culmination in the early 1970s with 2 treaties of modernity, as I will call them, which I have already mentioned before, namely Tucker-Parsons' The System of Modern Societies, published in 1971, which is a sociology of modernity as a stable, functionally differentiated system, and John Rawls' Theory of Justice of the same year, which is a political philosophy of modernity based on the image of what Rawls himself called a well-ordered society, from which then criteria for justice could be derived. So the concern with dynamics, with fragility and instability, had disappeared, had been laid to rest. But, and with that I come to the concluding section of the presentation, at the time at which Parsons and Rawls were writing these treaties, a transformation of modernity was already underway, namely the one which then Lyotard should diagnose only a few years later. Maybe, this is a conjecture, sometime from now, we will see Parsons and Rawls and the related debate around 1970 as the last illusion of an achieved Western modernity that could become a model for the world. Now, let me come to the concluding section and a reflection, a conclusion from these reflections up to this point, and then a focus on the present. As I said at the beginning, I want to suggest to you that we live in that present that started in the 1970s and in the 1980s, that this is the period we still live in, and that we should see it as a transformation of modernity, a transformation of modernity driven by critique and by crisis. So we see then that in the 1980s and 1990s, to some extent that continues, we have 2 strands of debate. Some theorists look at transformations of modernity, still keeping only the West in mind. My earlier work was a bit of that kind, I have to admit. And other theorists take a global perspective, but take it very broadly in the context of post-colonial and decolonial debates, decentering the Western experience. But also the work of Shmuel Eisenstadt is important here, developing a more appropriate historical and comparative perspective. So we have from there, even though the debates are a bit limited and still disconnected in the 1980s and 1990s, a new focus on plurality of modernity and on transformations rather than stability of modernity. This is a sign of uncertainty and disorientation, and we can see that very clearly. In the opening remarks to this conference this morning, which I listened into, there was a debate, a mention of the current context of neoliberalism and neoconservatism and the concerns that arise in that context. I share that, but I want to suggest that we need to understand the origins of these developments, and they are related they are situated in the 1970s and 1980s. And they are related to a number of elements which I just want to enumerate. The hopes for an orderly move away from colonial rule were dashed. There was decolonization, but it became very soon problematic. Governability problems, as they were called, arose in the so-called advanced societies as a consequence of student, workers, and civil rights movements from the late 1960s onwards. Suddenly, the apparent post-war social consensus had disappeared. Furthermore, governments in some of these supposedly modern societies abandoned Keynesian economic steering. Enterprises moved manufacturing to non-Western societies with low wages and less protection of the environment. The Iranian Revolution brought an end to the idea that non-Western societies were just a bit behind on the same modernizing trajectory. And the rise of the Japanese economy suggested that a capitalism with a non-Protestant cultural background could compete successfully with the allegedly more advanced economies. Thus, there were signs of crises all over in the 1970s and 1980s. And many of those were related to the mobilization and stronger presence of non-Western societies in global affairs, on the one hand, and secondly, with the mobilization of broader population groups calling for participation in political affairs. Then, as we know, the collapse of Soviet socialism happened, and very briefly, this was interpreted as the beginning of globalization and individualization as rather a smooth process, which would just support and lead to the breakthrough of individualist liberal modernity. But rather, we can see now that this marked the beginning of multiple projects of world making, for which, among others, the BRICS alliance of Brazil, Russia, China, India, and South Africa is one important indicator. So we see then that these developments take place in a new context of global connectedness, of indeed an intensification of global consciousness. This all is an exit from the very organized modernity of the period before, apparently well ordered in a first world of liberal capitalism, a second world of existing socialism, and a third world of supposedly developing and modernizing countries. Now we have a number of analyses of these forms of organized modernity in various world regions. In Latin America, for Brazil and China, we have some works. For Soviet Russia, the Soviet Union and Russia afterwards. I think Ibrahim Kaya is present, who has written on the transformation on Turkish modernity. So what we can see also as a sum of these analyses that taken together, we don't just see the end of organized modernity, but we see varieties of exiting of organized modernity where new interpretations are proposed and tried out. Now I want to suggest that there are two elements which are key to this current situation. The one are these global contours, which lead to increasingly talking about the planetary limits of the human condition. And secondly is the now very widely diffused, almost global commitment to formal equality. After the end of colonialism, we have formally equal states, a world composed of formally equal states. And in many, not all, but in many of these states, we have formal equality of rights for all the citizens and subjects in these states. Both of this is a new condition, formal equality of political collectivities and individuals, and the high degree of global connectedness. But we should stay away from the assumption that this now means that we indeed have achieved global modernity with reaching an endpoint in this understanding of freedom and reason. Rather, what we can see on the one side, we see that there is a broad commitment to human rights and democracy globally, but we also see that across societies and within societies, this new political self-understanding leads to an increased capacity of elites to deliberately displace problems instead of solving them. So among those, we see also that the increased focus on individual human rights has often gone away with a decreased global commitment to social solidarity. But let me focus in conclusion on one aspect which has come to the fore more recently, namely the planetary boundaries of human existence. This is an aspect which neither in the philosophy of modernity nor in the sociology of modernity has been focused upon, and why there have been analyses within history about the material basis of human social life, they have not been placed in the center of the understanding of world history. So I want to suggest that we need to rethink the overall trajectory of modernity in the light of, on the one hand, the increasing acceptance, global acceptance of concepts such as democracy, rights, and freedom. On the other hand, however, that this focus has, or the social organization based on such a focus has led to the neglect of the role of biophysical resources and the way they have transformed the conditions of organized social life. Let me do this very briefly, going back somewhat to the historical periods. I said before that the period around 1800, which we refer to economically as Industrial Revolution, indeed meant the first systematic exploration of the vertical frontier, in this case mostly with regard to iron and coal. This, in connection with the triangular Atlantic trade, freed European societies from the Malthusian constraints. Keep in mind that Malthus wrote his treatise on population, where he emphasized that famines and wars will always happen when the human population overgrows the soil's capacity to feed them. West European societies exited from this constraint due to this combination of vertical frontier and Atlantic expansion. Rather than looking at knowledge achievements in the Industrial Revolution, we need to see that resource extraction intensified in the first major step. The second major step is taken around 1900, a period which we call the Second Industrial Revolution, which is now sometimes seen as the first globalization, and at the same time, the moment of building of organized modernity. But from the resource angle, this is the period of a second and ultimately more important exploration of a vertical frontier, namely with oil and gas. This has been called by economic historians the golden age of resource-based development. And indeed, it sets, first of all, Western societies on the track towards the great acceleration in the use of fossil fuels after the Second World War in the second half of the 20th century. So we need to set this in the place of organized, in the context of organized modernity, because it's at the same time the moment when states consolidate states in Europe, but also in other world regions consolidate, but in very different forms. In Europe, and to some extent in the US, to some extent, societies become increasingly egalitarian and inclusive with the help of fossil fuels, creating a consumer society, a consumer capitalism, and with the help of emigration to other parts of the world, not least the Americas and Southern Africa and Australia. So in these parts of the world, we have resource use for export for the industrial societies, and at the same time, the creation of hierarchical, asymmetric societies in which a minority, often of European settlers, governs over the native population. So this is the beginning of both the apparent social-political model of Western modernity, but at the same time, a global context in which global social inequality and the origins of climate change emerge due to the second frontier. We live in this period, and we are, since the 1970s, the period I referred to before, aware of this ecological crisis accentuated by climate change from the end of the 20th century onwards. But we have overall not fully integrated into our representation of the trajectories of modernity this crucial connection between the biophysical resources on which modernity stands and the form of social political organization that this permits. So the normative achievements which some may want to associate with modernity, they are bought at the price of displacing problems to some extent for some period towards other world regions. And as this is less and less possible because of the rise of other world regions into a future that we can no longer control. So these periods, this period, the situation we find ourselves in, make the history of modernity truly global, and it requires us to take a global perspective from its very beginnings. It also means giving new meaning to the term postmodern condition, namely, in spite of anything else, it may mean the end of the dominant understanding of instrumental mastery, namely as instrumental mastery over other people and over the planet. Instrumental mastery over other people is no longer possible because the end of the colonial situation, and mastery over the planet is no longer possible because of the reaching of planetary boundaries. Thus, this moment will also spell the final end of modernization theory for reasons of neglecting the key material condition for the trajectory of Western modernity up to now. In turn, what it will demand is collective creativity for elaborating an imaginary of sustainable modernity that takes into account the plurality and diversity of modern experiences. I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
All right, dear Peter, I would like to thank you for your thought-provoking and inspiring speech. We had a chance to analyze modernity from different perspectives. If you would be so kind, we now would like to host a short Q&A session with questions direct from our participants. There are 4 questions here. Can you see them, or do you want me to direct them to you?
Just a second, I have to open. The first question I see, in your philosophical account, you mentioned instrumental mastery. What do you mean by that? The first question, and the second question by the same speaker is rationality of the individual. Has it come to be a dangerous thing in contemporary times? Can we say that this because of the lack of self-understanding and who and what is to blame? Yes, by instrumental mastery, I mean certainly in the Enlightenment understanding of freedom and reason, reason refers to our human capacity to relate to ourselves, to other human beings, and to nature, to the natural world in, well, reasonable terms with a normative assumption. But if we consider with the term, so that is a kind of mastery, that we control our relations in all these three respects. But by instrumental mastery, I mean a particular form of mastery, namely mastering ourselves and others and nature with a view to a purpose, about something that we want to achieve. And that is a very limited understanding of mastery. And for that reason, it is also something which we need and we need to appreciate, but it is limited when it becomes unsuitable, like we should not treat other human beings as an instrument for our purposes. And we have come to learn more recently that we can also not treat nature and the planet as being there for our purpose, because it will undermine our way of life. And this means then, I think that is related to your second question, if the rationality of the individual becomes instrumental in this way, then it is indeed dangerous. And one can argue that this indeed has been one trend in recent history, a trend which has also counter trends. I don't belong to those who think that this is unavoidable, but we need to see that when we dismantle institutions and when we destroy common bases of life, often an instrumental attitude is the only thing that remains. I hope that answered this question. I move to the second one.
Özgür Emrah Güral.
Should I go on?
From Özgür Emrah Güral. He has
yes,
two questions as well.
Forgive me if I don't read the names because my pronunciation would be unrecognizable. So,
don't worry about it.
Yeah. Michel Foucault's philosophical investigation in the 1970s, whether they brought together the philosophical, sociological, and historical analysis of modernity, and how these three models of modernity are related to democratic theory, whether they enhance it, or whether we need a more comprehensive understanding of modern society for a more inclusive and democratic society. Yes, in Foucault, there are philosophical, sociological, and historical elements. I agree. I wouldn't say that he brought them together, because also in different works of his, he placed the emphasis on different aspects, and maybe they are never fully brought together in his works. I say that with all admiration for what he has done. To say it in a different way, the one text late in his life where he addresses Kant's question on what is the Enlightenment and reads it in his own terms, this comes very close to bringing this together, where he indeed says, and much of what I've been saying is built on such an assumption, that when Kant was writing about the exit from self-incurred immaturity or domination, that this is the beginning of modernity, that one shouldn't read Kant as saying that a new and better era starts, rather that Kant was writing at the moment of exit, of exiting from an earlier situation, but that indeed he didn't say that the new era would be fine and without any problems. He was just saying that we need to exit from our earlier conditions, we need to emancipate ourselves, and then new problems will arise. And Foucault, 2 centuries later, writes in the light of these new problems. And in that sense, and they are philosophical, sociological, and historical at the same time. In that sense, yes. Democratic theory, briefly, yes, there is a connection. I think the connection, it's a long connection and it is not a linear one. But if we consider in this long history, which I tried to trace very quickly, that at the beginning there is freedom, and that by implication, we see that in De las Casas already in the 16th century, once one thinks about human freedom, it is very difficult to assume that this freedom is given to us, but not to others. And once we agree on equal freedom, this should also only be one step away from equal political participation, in other words, democracy for everyone. So I think, yes, I think the brought together we have there a basis for a democratic approach. But again, and that is goes back to Foucault's insight as well, often one has assumed that we only have to theorize this and then we are fine, but rather we have to understand what new problems we then have if we want to communicate globally on equal terms with everyone else and solve the problems we face. These are enormous issues which are not well addressed at all at this moment. The next questions are in Turkish, so I need help.
Yeah, I'll help you with that. Okay, Orçun Gürgen is asking, how do you evaluate today's European modernity in view of the latest developments in the European Union? And also, Yahya Altunkurt is asking, they think that there's a confusion between conceptual content and promises of the modernity with different types of modernisms in practice. What do you think about that? They're asking.
Yes, thank you very much for both of these questions. Well, on European modernity and the current state of Europe, I think one can see that Europe has been, let me only talk about Europe after the Second World War, before it gets an even much more complex issue. Europe is tied in this dilemma that on the one hand, after the Second World War, it has produced a form of social political organization which has become a model in other parts of the world because of its achievements in many respects. But at the same time, it has never or rarely faced explicitly the conditions for this to emerge, which are the conditions of displacing one's own problems in other world regions and into the future. Now, this has become unavoidable, and the European Union is facing that with the pandemic, with climate change, with migration. So there is an awareness of that, but it's still very far away from a full understanding, and especially an understanding which the European political elites also dare to address openly. Rather, they resort to various kinds of populism, and that only means a further denial of these issues. On the second question, if I understand it correctly, yes, there is, but what I would, one way in which I like to put this is that one can see, if we look at the philosophy of modernity, the history of the philosophy of modernity, we indeed see promissory notes. And I think one can see, at least from the beginning of the 19th century onwards, or the late 18th century onwards, that in the light of these notes, something like an imaginary of modernity emerges, which is related with freedom, equality, and democracy. But I think where I differ from other scholars, I don't think that these are truly concepts that can be institutionalized. Rather, they are an imaginary, they are in need of interpretation, and they need to be interpreted in the light of the situation one finds itself in. And this often means that that ambivalences and ambiguities come to the fore, so that every existing interpretation of modernity is always a very specific case and can always be seen to fall short of the promises of modernity. Thank you.
And thank you. And there is this question: given contemporary conditions, is modernity possible without being capitalist or Western-centric? What do you think about this? How would you evaluate is going on modernity in countries like Qatar, which is fully integrated into the capitalist accumulation economy, but has created a politically distinctive amalgam?
Yes. The first part of the question, I think in our contemporary circumstances, modernity in the end will turn out to be only possible if it becomes truly global. If the current global condition with a multiplicity of political, cultural, social forces is accepted. Because the I think we already live the moment of the end of Western domination, which is not yet accepted by everyone globally, but it is unavoidable. So modernity can only be global if it is to persist. Secondly, the second question would lead us into a big debate about capitalism. There, I think, I mean, certainly the history of modernity cannot be understood without the driving dynamics of expansionist capitalism and imperialism. But I'm sometimes worried about a tendency of critical observers to refer to capitalism as if it explains everything. And so what we need really is a debate about what capitalism is. For instance, I'm doubtful whether we can organize the current economy without wage labor. So if wage labor is crucial for capitalism, I'm not sure we can do without capitalism. But what is clearly the case is that current global capitalism has become a kind of dogma and has become unleashed in terms of this expansionist drives without accepting any boundaries to economic activity and economic rationality. So what is rather at stake is, borrowing the term from Polanyi, a new great transformation which frames capitalist economic practices in such a way that they become truly compatible both with sustainability, but maybe even more importantly with democracy and equality. And we are very far from that. I'm very critical of current capitalism, but I'm less happy with a kind of argument that says capitalism is the source of all problems. About Qatar, maybe I can say something about Qatar. I think it's extremely hypocritical and short-term interest-based, the way in which capitalist countries and capitalist enterprises relate to so obviously unsustainable and oppressive political contexts like the Qatarian one.
Thank you, Professor. There's another question about the relation between geography and the concepts you talked about modern times. And she's asking the synthesis thought of geography. How do you think it will be shaped in the future?
Yes, I mean, I've come to see that geography, one also sees that, I think, in academic terms, in university terms, has become an ever more central discipline for many debates, where geographical contributions, often under the heading of social geography or human geography, become central for broader debates about modernity, capitalism, democracy. So the spatial, the territorial component of our human condition and our ways of organizing our lives is very central. We also see that in relation to what I concluded on the biophysical resources. They are always in some place and some space where they are extracted or maybe should not be extracted. So in that sense, geography is central. And what I see, not being a specialist myself, is that there are important movements among geographers to indeed address this and open up for this broader debate about the spatial basis of the human condition.
All right, that's all. We kept you too long. I know that. You should be tired by now. Thanks a lot for your time, for your effort, and for everything, for your participation. It was a great session. Thanks a lot again.
Thank you for inviting me and providing this occasion. And thanks to everyone for the very interesting and pertinent questions. It has been a great pleasure for me. Thank you.
All right. Goodbye.
Bye.